Raging Bull marked the start of a new era for Martin Scorsese. He's been open about the fact that a number of his projects in the 80s were made with the worry that he'd never work again if he didn't take them on, or they were in order to get something else made, to build up to a passion project. And Raging Bull was the first of these. He's turned it down multiple times over the years. Robert De Niro brought it to him, and almost each production that they worked on together, even ones they didn't work on together, since 1974, he'd read the book Raging Bull, the autobiography of Jake LaMotta, and became fascinated with the character. But Scorsese kept turning it down. He had a lack of interest in sport, in boxing movies. The only one he really liked was Buster Keaton's Battling Butler, which is a really good Buster Keaton film for those who haven't seen it. Otherwise, his view was of reels that were shown in between films as he was growing up. Two figures in the middle of a square, having a scrap at each other. Nothing really emotionally engaging, nothing cinematically great. It was a static shot, no cuts. There was nothing for him to properly be engaged by. And then a near-death experience following heavy drug use throughout the late 70s caused him to overdose and be hospitalised. And on visiting him, De Niro placed the book in front of him one more time and asked him to make the film. And Scorsese reluctantly agreed, fearing that otherwise his career would be over if he didn't take it on, if he didn't have something to work on. He'd said that Raging Bull was where he had to almost entirely relearn how to make a movie, and I think that he went back to the films that led him to fall in love with the medium in the first place, particularly westerns in this case, the genre which had a strong effect on the director as a child, and even more so when it became ground for more moral battles in the 50s. Jake LaMotta wants to be seen as this macho, in-control figure. He wants to be John Wayne. But the John Wayne he ends up being is like the one we see in The Searchers, or in The Quiet Man, where his character accidentally kills another man in the ring. The man who co-star Maureen O'Hara described as, when you had the sock duke, you always had to wonder whether he was going to accept it and let you, or he was going to strangle you. Both Wayne starrers were influences on Raging Bull, particularly The Searchers. Scorsese described seeing it for the first time with the feeling of knowing what you would get from two collaborators, Johns, Ford and Wayne, working together again. And as he would say, suddenly this character, this lonely character, comes out of the desert and he's absolutely terrifying. He literally acts out the racism, the worst aspects of racism in our country. You can see the hate, see it building, and he acts it out. He becomes obsessive. He just shows us the worst part of ourselves that's coming out of the late 40s, early 50s. Wayne Ethan Edwards is a bitter, lonely character, one who would also influence other Scorsese characters, like Taxi Driver's Travis Bickle, in the way he acts his own hate and isolation. A flawed, complicated hero whose lack of morality forces him to wander alone instead of being invited into the house at the end of the film in that iconic shot. He's a soul wandering the dusty plains as the film questions whether his actions can forgive his hateful qualities and redeem him in any way. Jake LaMotta may be a champion fighter, but can we support him as such when we see his heated, tormented fights and attacks in his personal life? LaMotta acts out internalised feelings of jealousy, anxiety and insecurity. There's rage in the ring and outside. The film itself was one made with rage. It's been said that around the time personal relationships, worries and stresses, throughout much of the early to mid-80s, they were causing Scorsese to become a very angry figure, perhaps not the nicest or most pleasant person to be around. Whilst watching De Niro act out a scene where LaMotta breaks down, furiously punching a prison cell wall, he realised that he was watching himself. The film was never made as a biopic as such. It was made with the idea of Jake LaMotta being an interpretation. The real LaMotta was on set to advise for the boxing sequences, but not anything else. Scorsese and De Niro knew when they were doing work on the screenplay. It was eventually credited to Paul Schrader and Martin, both of whom did very different drafts of the screenplay. Martin did one which was said to be more of a journalistic side of things, based on a number of newspaper articles as well. Schrader, on the other hand, made a very violent, this is bound to be X-rated film, something that the studio didn't want to touch. I mean, they didn't really want to touch Raging Bull in general. Irvin Winkler, the producer, had to say to them, look, if you're not going to make Raging Bull, I'm not going to let you make Rocky 2. And so they wanted Rocky 2, they needed another hit. And so they had to greenlight Raging Bull in order for that to be the case. Now, how you feel about the fact that we got Rocky 2 in the end, your opinions may vary. But one thing has to be acknowledged, and that's from Rocky 2, we got Rocky 4, so we all won in some way. Anyway, we had very different drafts of the Raging Bull script over the years, and Scorsese and De Niro took those, did some work on the latest draft for a couple of weeks, and knew that they couldn't do it as a straight biopic, because otherwise you'd have a Rashomon situation with all the different views and relationships of the central character, many of which, as you'll see in the film, were very tumultuous. And so an interpretation was needed, one in which people might be able to see different parts of themselves in. He was certainly formed with different aspects of the key cast and crew. And it's weird to think of a film like Raging Bull as being therapeutic, perhaps not in tone and feeling, but in the effect and connection that we can have with it. That's one of the great things about cinema. And the film reignited filmmaking for Scorsese and showed him something of himself. Referring to the Bible quote that closes the film, it was placed there for his NYU professor, Haig Manoogian, which is a great name. He'd passed away just before the film was finishing production, and Scorsese's longtime editor, Thelma Schoonmaker, who was also in some of those classes, said that it was perhaps there to say that Scorsese felt that he'd finally made a film that justified everything he'd argued about with his teacher over the years. The director himself would say, the real Jake became a character for Bob and Paul and Mardik and myself and everybody. Through that journey I was able to see something that I hadn't seen in myself really. It also meant Haig too, because he was able to make me see in a sense, to be able to actually put whatever's in here and here, pointing to his head and his heart, onto film. That was the work I was doing. It was on film. Can't help it. It wasn't on a canvas, it was not clay, it was not a book, it was on film. So it was a personal thing, purely personal. I did not mean it to mean Jake LaMotta as a character, it was more about Haig and the process of making the film about this quote-unquote Jake LaMotta. Not the real Jake, but the Jake that somehow comes out of the film and is perceived differently by different people over the years. You make up who Jake is in the movie. And so that's what it meant. I didn't think anyone was going to see the picture. Well, 46 years later, we're still all here seeing it. LaMotta may be the flawed hero, he may be the isolated wanderer or a fountain of toxic rage, he may be a needed mirror. He was all of those for Scorsese, acting as something of a personal and professional turning point for the director as he got back behind the camera and put whatever it was in his head and his heart in front of it, driven to trying to get his passion projects off the ground. Last Temptation of Christ and Gangs of New York would be a few years and films away, but Raging Bull gave the director the punch to work towards them. Not bad for a film he spent 4 years dodging. And so please everyone sit back and enjoy Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull.